Forget about the days of America the Empire. These days it's hard enough to find anything in America that's really even American anymore. America's favorite beer, Budweiser, now owned by Belgium. That's pathetic. Increasingly, nations like Saudi Arabia are buying stake in major American companies. And, if you believe anything the Republican Party has said at least, then Barack Obama is owned by Iraq, Iran, Syria, every other nation in the Middle East, and he's been endorsed by the devil. This continued purchasing of America, however, was only continued last week, when the federal government took over both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two of the largest players in the mortgage industry, away from the shareholders. And as the Boston Globe of this morning points out, troubles inside of the financial markets abound, with major companies like AIG now facing possible turnovers, and also the possible liquidation of other major companies. And it is because America's economy right now is in dire straits. Many analysts are trying to assume which way the Federal Reserve will go, asking themselves today's question. Should the Federal Reserve cut interest rates? And the answer is absolutely. First, inflation is no longer significant of a threat. Moreover, the credit crunch has sucked liquidity out of the market. And finally, America needs to rebound our economy, because right now, growth isn't assured. One of the major reasons why the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates over the next few years is that right now inflation doesn't seem as staggering of a problem. The reason for this, mainly, is that consumers are now sitting back on their wallets. The International Herald Tribune of yesterday points out that unlike the past several months, inflation has now largely subsided, especially inside of goods outside of commodities, mainly because people, now that the economy is really contracting, are spending much less. As a result, the inflationary pressures from buyers, when demand is outpaced and actually you can't keep up with supply, is no longer there, and thus, inflation isn't as big of a threat. But another reason why inflation isn't a huge problem is that the dollar's fortunes have actually improved in recent weeks. Currency Trader of summer 2008 makes this clear, saying that currencies like the euro, the European area currency, and also currencies like the yen, the Japanese currency, have significantly weakened in recent weeks. As a result, since investors are pulling out of the strongest currency right now, the euro, they're going to invest in the greatest undervalued currency, the dollar. And since investors are losing taste for cash carry currencies, currencies like the yen, currencies that people pick up one day only to flip over the next, they're also going to put their money in the dollar, which means that the dollar in the future is significantly going to be improved. And when that happens, since the dollar impacts the purchasing power parity of the United States, the price of goods inside of the U.S. is significantly curtailed. And thus, the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates because it has a lot of leeway on inflation, meaning they should focus on unemployment and negative economic growth. But the other reason why the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates at its next meeting is because right now the credit crunch has sucked liquidity out of the market. Let's look at the past. The Boston Globe of yesterday points out that the major fault that companies like Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac had was they bought unsecured mortgages. Mortgages like subprime mortgages, where you didn't actually check the financial background of the people, and it often went to people who were poor, and Alt-A mortgages. Mortgages that were thought to be less risky, but actually were a hefty bargain. As a result, once these mortgages imploded, and the housing market went downhill too, then these companies lost huge amounts of money, which is why companies like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Bear Stearns have had problems. But that created a problem for the future. The Financial Times of yesterday points out that liquidity, or excess money in the market, is now being sucked up because these companies are no longer as willing to give out money. In other words, these companies took major hits in the past and lost a ton of money, and right now, they're more willing to sit back on their money than give it to the people, which means that the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates to loosen monetary policy and inject more money into the market. and in doing so, the Federal Reserve could help stimulate growth. But perhaps one of the greatest reasons why the Federal Reserve should actually cut interest rates is because in the future, we can't rely on growth. The reason for this is that consumers inside of the United States are no longer buying as much. The Washington Post of yesterday points out that consumer confidence has hit all-time lows, particularly after the takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. As a result, growth driven by the American consumer is no longer an option. So let's look at export-driven growth. As the Boston Globe of yesterday points out, for the past several months, the reasons the United States have stayed above negative growth is because nations like China and the Euro area are buying up American goods. Unfortunately, that is no longer a possibility, mainly because the appreciation in the dollar makes our goods much more expensive overseas, at the exact same time that markets in places like the European Union, China, and Southeast Asia are extremely contracted. Thus, growth is no longer a possibility or even a likelihood in the future, and the Federal Reserve needs to focus on that. And thus, they should cut interest rates. And it is because the American economy today is in shatters. Many analysts have asked themselves today's question. Should the Federal Reserve cut interest rates? And we saw the answer was absolutely. First, because the United States no longer has such a huge threat from inflation. Moreover, because the United States had a credit crunch that sucked liquidity out of the market. And finally, because in the rest of the world, export-driven growth is no longer an option, and thus, the U.S. economy needs a major stimulus. If the United States can continue its current policies and at least improve economic growth slightly, and the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, then the American economy may finally rebound, and growth will appreciate. And that's truly one of the few ideas left in America that's really American.
Testing.